Today we have some more actual history about the Puritans of colonial Massachusetts. This episode follows up our recent episode on the treatment of Quakers by Puritans in the 17th century. Today we will hear the story of Margaret Jones, who was the first woman charged with witchcraft in New England in 1648. This story was mentioned in our previous episode on the Quaker invasion of Massachusetts, and today we will read a full account of this and other events of 1648 from this book, Winthrop's Journal, History of New England, 1630 to 1649. This book was written by one of the first governors of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, as his journal, and these journals were published in 1908. In addition to the story of Margaret Jones, we will read several other incidents that Winthrop documented in his journal in 1648. He discusses interactions with the Dutch colony in New York, as well as religious conflict between New England Puritans and the Anglican settlers in Virginia. Virginia Governor William Berkeley ordered some Puritan ministers who had come to Virginia from New England to leave. We will also hear about some of the interactions with the native Indian tribes nearby, including intertribal conflicts that the settlers of these colonies helped to resolve in order to avoid war. One thing you'll notice about these Puritans in New England is that they had very strong beliefs that everything came about as the result of divine providence. So here's the story of the first witch put to death in New England, as well as other events of 1648 and early 1649. 1648. This year corn was very scarce, and so it was in all the countries of Europe. Our scarcity came by occasion of our transporting much to the West Indies and the Portugal and Spanish islands. The magistrates sent out to have a survey of the corn in the country, and finding it to fall very short, the next general court made an order to prohibit transportation, except of such as should be brought in from other parts, and such as were sold before to be transported, etc. Yet this restraint notwithstanding, the price did not rise much in the bushel, nor was the scarcity much felt among the people. Mr. Eaton, having again moved the governor to know the mind of the court touching the Dutch governor's proceedings, the court appointed a committee to consider of it, after the court was adjourned, and withal to consider of the Articles of Confederation, and some of the commissioners' orders, for there was some murmuring among the people about the inequality of some articles, as that we bearing more than half the charge upon all occasions, etc., should yet have no more commissioners than the smallest of the other, and that all charges should be levied by the poll, considering how great a part of our people were laborers and craftsmen, and of theirs the most were farmers and well-stocked, etc. On May 28th, soon after the court was adjourned, the governor received 2 letters from the Dutch governor, holding forth much assurance of his sincere affection, to a firm peace and neighborly compliance with all the English, and that upon these grounds, 1. Our unity in the true religion, 2. The ancient league between the two nations, 3. The community in danger in respect of the common enemy, both Spaniards and Indians, 4. The reconciling former differences and preventing future, 5. The benefit of a mutual league, both offensive and defensive against a common enemy. And he offered to meet Mr. Bradford, the governor of Plymouth, and Mr. Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, at Connecticut, at such a time as we should appoint, and to refer all to us. The governor returned answer to him of what gladness he conceived in his forwardness to peace, and had no reason to doubt of his cordial intentions, etc., promising to further the meeting what lay in his power. There was some reason why the Dutch governor's spirit should begin to fall, both in regard of the weakness of the state of Holland, especially the West India Company, were fallen into, which was not the least occasion of their late peace with Spain, and also in respect of the doubts which he was fallen into at this time, both from his own unruly people, and also of their neighbor Indians, for neither would his people be restrained from furnishing the Indians with guns, powder, etc., nor would the Indians be without that trade, and the great loss the company had sustained by the late wreck of 3 ships, and the old governor and many principal men with him, made him doubtful of any great supply from Holland. On June 4th here arrived one Sir Edmund Plowden, who had been in Virginia about 7 years. He came first with a patent of a county palatine for Delaware Bay, but wanting a pilot for that place, he went to Virginia, and there, having lost the estate he brought over, and all his people scattered from him, he came hither to return to England for supply, intending to return and plant Delaware, if he could get sufficient strength to dispossess the Swedes. This new year a way was found out to Connecticut by Nashaway, which avoided much of the hilly way. The magistrates, being informed at a court of assistance that 4 or 5 Indians, who lived upon the spoil of their neighbors, had murdered some Indians of Nipnets, who were subject to this government, and robbed their wigwam, sent 20 men to Nashaway to inquire of the truth of the matter, and to apprehend the murderers if they could be found. But being fled to Narragansett, they returned, and informed us certainly of the persons murdered, and of the actors, etc., which was of this good use, though they cannot apprehend them, that the Indians saw our care of them and readiness to protect them, and revenge their wrongs. After this, 2 Indians of Cutchamaikans procuring, offering themselves to apprehend some of the murderers, we gave them commission, and withal wrote to Mr. Pynchon to assist them, they being near Springfield. Mr. Pynchon offered his assistance, but wrote to the governor that the Indians murdered, nor yet the murderers, were not our subjects, and withal that it would endanger a war, whereupon the governor, advising with the deputy, etc., wrote back presently to Mr. Pynchon that then he should proceed no further, but send back to the Indians. At this court, one Margaret Jones of Charlestown was indicted and found guilty of witchcraft, and hanged for it. The evidence against her was, 1, that she was found to have such a malignant touch as many persons, men, women, and children, whom she stroked or touched with any affection or displeasure, or etc., were taken with deafness, or other violent pains or sickness. 2, she practicing physic, and her medicines being such things as by her own confession were harmless, as aniseed, liquors, etc., yet had extraordinary violent effects. 3, she would use to tell such as would not make use of her physic that they would never be healed, and accordingly their diseases and hurts continued, with relapse against the ordinary course, and beyond the apprehension of all physicians and surgeons. 4, some things which she foretold came to pass accordingly, other things she could tell of as secret speeches, etc., which she had no ordinary means to come to the knowledge of. 5, she had, upon search, an apparent teat in her secret parts, as fresh as if it had been newly sucked, and after it had been scanned upon a forced search, it was withered, and another began on the opposite side. 6, in the prison, in the clear daylight, there was seen in her arms, she sitting on the floor, and her clothes up, etc., a little child, which ran from her into another room, and the officer following it, it was vanished. The like child was seen in 2 other places, to which she had relation, and one maid that saw it fell sick upon it, and was cured by the said Margaret, who used means to be employed to that end. Her behavior at her trial was very intemperate, lying notoriously and railing upon the jury and witnesses, etc., and in the like distemper she died. The same day and hour she was executed, there was a very great tempest at Connecticut, which blew down many trees. June 4th, the wife of one Willop of Exeter was found in the river dead, her neck broken, her tongue black and swollen out of her mouth, and the blood settled in her face, the privy parts swollen, etc., as if she had been much abused. A vessel of Connecticut, being the last winter at Carasso, in the possession of the Dutch, found there a black man who had lost his legs, and had been sent hither out of Holland to perform such service to the governor as he was fit for, having been trained up to some learning in Holland. This man had attained to some good savour of religion, so as he grew weary of the Dutch of the island, who were very debauched. Only one man he found some piety in, and there being Indians in the island, he acquainted himself with them, and having attained some skill in their language, he began to instruct them and their children in the knowledge of God. And the Lord so blessed his endeavors, as the Indians began to hearken to him, and yielded themselves to be taught at certain times which this black man appointed. This man told the master of the English vessel, one Bull, a godly and discreet man, of all his proceedings and what comfort he had found in that one godly Dutchman, saying that he was never in his company but he found Jesus Christ warming him at the heart. He inquired of Bull about New England, and our religion and churches, and asked if we were of those Christians who advance the doctrine of merits, etc., and much rejoiced when he heard the truth of our doctrine, and showed himself very desirous to see New England, and so he left him at that time. The Welcome of Boston, about 300 tons, riding before Charlestown, having in her 80 horses and 120 tons of ballast, in calm weather, fell to rolling, and continued so about 12 hours, so as though they brought a great weight to the one side, yet she would heel to the other, and so deep as they feared her foundering. It was then the time of the county court at Boston, and the magistrates hearing of it, and withal that one Jones, the husband of the witch lately executed, had desired to have passage in her to Barbados, and could not have it without such payment. They sent the officer presently with a warrant to apprehend him, one of them saying that the ship would stand still as soon as he was in prison. And as the officer went and was passing over the ferry, one man said to him, "You can tame men sometimes, can't you tame this ship?" The officer answered, "I have that man here that it may be will tame her, and make her be quiet." And with that showed his warrants, and at the same instant she began to stop and presently stayed. And after that he was put in prison, and the ship moved no more. There appeared over the harbor at New Haven in the evening the form of the keel of a ship with 3 masts, to which were suddenly added all the tackling and sails, and presently after, upon the top of the poop, a man standing with one hand akimbo under his left side, and in his right hand a sword stretched out toward the sea. Then from the side of the ship, which was close to the town, arose a great smoke, which covered all the ship, and in that smoke she vanished away. But some saw her keel sink into the water. This was seen by many men and women, and it continued about a quarter of an hour. August 15th. The Synod met at Cambridge by adjournment from the 4th June last. Mr. Allen of Dedham preached out of Acts 15, a very godly, learned, and particular handling of near all the doctrines and applications concerning that subject, with a clear discovery and refutation of such errors, objections, and scruples as had been raised about it by some young heads in the country. It fell out about the midst of his sermon. There came a snake into the seat, where many of the elders sat behind the preacher. It came in at the door, where people stood thick upon the stairs. Many of the elders shifted from it, but Mr. Thompson, one of the elders of Braintree, a man of much faith, trode upon the head of it, and so held it with his foot and staff with a small pair of grains, until it was killed. This being so remarkable, and nothing falling out but by divine providence, it is out of doubt the Lord discovered somewhat of his mind in it. The serpent is the devil, the Synod the representative of the churches of Christ in New England. The devil had formerly and lately attempted their disturbance and dissolution, but their faith in the seed of the woman overcame him and crushed his head. The Synod went on comfortably, and intended only the framing of a confession of faith, etc., and a form of church discipline, not entertaining any other business. For the first, they wholly agreed with that which the Assembly in England had lately set forth. For other, viz. For discipline, they drew it by itself, according to the general practice of our churches. So they ended in less than 14 days. This month, when our first harvest was near had in, the pigeons came again all over the country, but did no harm, harvest being just in, but proved a great blessing, it being incredible what multitudes of them were killed daily. It was ordinary for one man to kill 8 or 10 dozen in half a day, yea, 5 or 6 dozen at one shoot, and some 7 or 8. Thus the Lord showed us that he could make the same creature, which formerly had been a great chastisement, now to become a great blessing. About the midst of this summer there arose a fly out of the ground, about the bigness of the top of a man's little finger, of brown color. They filled the woods from Connecticut to Sudbury with a great noise, and ate up the youngest sprouts of the trees, but meddled not with the corn. They were also between Plymouth and Braintree, but came no further. If the Lord had not stopped them, they had spoiled all our orchards, for they did some few. At the last meeting of the Commissioners of New Haven, information was given them that Sequasham, a sachem near Hartford, would have hired an Indian to kill some of the magistrates of Hartford, whereupon he was sent for, but came not. And being about other Indians about Pacumtucket, they sent for Uncas, who undertook to fetch him, which he not being able to do by force, he surprised him in the night and brought him to Hartford, where he was kept in prison for many weeks. But there not being sufficient proof to convict him, etc., he was discharged. Yet the Indians from whom he was taken took it so to heart against Uncas, as they intended to make war upon him, and the Narragansetts sent wampum to encourage them. And accordingly in this month there were gathered together from many parts about 1,000 Indians armed, 300 or more having guns, powder, and bullets, and were at Pacumtucket preparing, etc., which the magistrates of Hartford hearing of, they sent 3 horsemen to them, one being very expert in the Indian language, to know their intent, and to tell them that if they made war upon Uncas, the English must defend him. The Indian sachems entertained the messengers courteously, and having heard their message, they took time to give their answer, which was this, that they knew the English to be a wise and warlike people, and they intended not to fall out with them. Therefore for the present they would desist, and consider further of the matter. And God had so disposed, as at the same instant they had intelligence of a defeat given to some of their confederates by other Indians, which called them to their aid, and also the Narragansett had failed to send them all the wampum he had promised. Thus the Lord delivered us from that war, which must needs have been very dangerous, especially to our brethren of Connecticut. The Narragansett and the Niantic, dealing thus underhand contrary to their covenants, and being yet behind near 1,000 fathom of the wampum they should have paid us long since. The commissioner sitting at Plymouth in September ordered 4 men to be sent to them, with an interpreter with instructions how to treat with them, both concerning hiring other Indians to war upon Uncas, and also about the wampum behind. Captain Atherton and Captain Pritchard assisted with 2 others, voluntarily took this service, and went hence. On October 3rd they were to have taken Benedict Arnold for their interpreter, but he being from home they went to Mr. Williams, who sent for the sachems. But they had heard that many horsemen were come to take them, which made Pesicus fly over to Rhode Island. Then our messengers went to Niantic, where Ninnicraft entertained them courteously. There they stayed the Lord's day, and came back with them to Mr. Williams. And then Pesicus and Canonicus's son, being delivered of their fear, came to them, and being demanded about hiring the Mohawks against Uncas, they solemnly denied it. Only they confessed that the Mohawk being a great sachem, and their ancient friend, and being come so near them, they sent some 20 fathom of wampum for him to tread upon, as the manner of Indians is. And Canonicus's son used this asseveration, which Englishmen's God doth know, that we did not send to stir up or hire the Mohawks against Uncas. Then they further promised that they would not meddle with Uncas, nor stir up any other against him, before they had all paid their debt of wampum to the English, and then they would require satisfaction for all the wrongs Uncas had done them, and if the English would not see them satisfied, they would consider what to do. And for their wampum behind, etc., they desired the English to bear with them, in regard their want of corn last winter, that made them lay out their wampum to the English for corn. But in the spring they could provide part of it, and the rest so soon as they could. October 8th. A shallop having been fishing at Monaghan, and returning with other boats, and being to put in at Demeral's Cove, the other boats fell to their oars, the wind failing, and called upon this boat to do the like, that they might be harbored before night. But they were slothful and neglected, etc., whereupon she missed her way, and was split upon a rock, and all the men being 4 and 1 Indian, and all the goods perished. In the time of our general court, here arrived from Virginia one Mr. Harrison, pastor of the church of Nansemond there, and reported to us that their church was grown to 118 persons, and many more looking towards it, which had stirred up the governor there, Sir William Berkeley, to raise persecution against them. And he had banished their elder Mr. Duran, and himself Mr. Harrison, and was to depart the country by the 3rd ship at the furthest, which had caused him to come now to take advice of the magistrates and elders here about the matter. First he spake with the magistrates, and propounded 2 things. 1, whether their church ought not to remove upon this persecution. 2, whether we would advise them to remove. To the first our answer was, that seeing God had carried on his work so graciously hitherto, and that there was so great hope of a far more plentiful harvest at hand, many of the council being well inclined, and 1,000 of the people by conjecture, they should not be hasty to remove, as long as they could stay upon any tolerable terms. In November, one Bezaleel Peyton of the Church of Boston, coming from Barbados in a vessel of 60 tons, was taken with a great storm of wind and rain at east in the night, between Cape Cod and the bay, so as he was forced to put out 2 anchors, but the storm increasing they were put from their anchors, and seeing no way but death before their eyes, they commended themselves to the Lord, who delivered them marvelously, for they were carried among Coney-Hassett rocks, yet touched none of them, and put on shore upon a beach, and presently there came a mighty sea, which lifted their vessel over the beach into a smooth water, and after the storm was over they used means, and got her safe out. The like example of the blessing of prayer fell out not long after in saving a small open vessel of ours, wherein was one Richard Collicutt of the Church of Dorchester, who, being eastward about trading, was carried by a violent storm among the rocks, where they could find no place to get out. So they went to prayer, and presently there came a great sea, and heaved their vessel over into the open sea, in a place between 2 rocks. January 1649. About 8 persons were drowned this winter, all by adventuring upon the ice, except 3, whereof 2, one of them being far in drink, would needs pass from Boston to Winnisumet, in a small boat and a tempestuous night. This man, using to come home to Winnisumet drunken, his wife would tell him he would one day be drowned, but he made light of it. Another went aboard a ship to make merry the last day at night, being the beginning of the Lord's day, and returning about midnight with 3 of the ship's company, the boat was overset by means of the ice. They guided her by a rope which went from the ship to the shore. The seamen waded out, but the Boston man was drowned. Being a man of good conversation, and hopeful of some work of grace begun in him, but drawn away by the seaman's invitation, God will be sanctified in them that come near him. 2 others were the children of one of the Church of Boston. While their parents were at the lecture, the boy, being about 7 years of age, having a small staff in his hand, ran down upon the ice towards a boat he saw, and the ice breaking he fell in. But his staff kept him up till his sister, about 14 years old, ran down to save her brother, though there were 4 men at hand who called to her not to go, being themselves hasting to save him, and so drowned herself, and him also, being past recovery ere the men could come at them, and could easily reach ground with their feet. The parents had no more sons, and confessed they had been too indulgent towards him, and had set their hearts over much upon him. This puts me in the mind of another child very strangely drowned a little before winter. The parents were also members of the Church of Boston. The father had undertaken to maintain the mill dam, and being at work upon it with some help he had hired, in the afternoon of the last day of the week, night came upon them before they had finished what they had intended, and his conscience began to put him in mind of the Lord's day, and he was troubled, yet went on and wrought an hour within nights. The next day, after evening exercise, and after they had supped, the mother put 2 children to bed in the room where themselves did lie, and they went out to visit a neighbor. When they returned, they continued about an hour in the room, and missed not the child. But then the mother going to bed, and not finding her youngest child, a daughter about 5 years of age, after much search she found it drowned in a well in her cellar, which was very observable as by a special hand of God, that the child should go out of that room into another at the dark, and then fall down at a trap door, or go down the stairs, and so into the well in the farther end of the cellar, the top of the well and the water being even with the ground. But the father freely in the open congregation did acknowledge it the righteous hand of God, for his profaning his holy day against the checks of his own conscience. So that is the end of Governor John Winthrop's journal that tells of the major events that occurred in Massachusetts in 1648 and the winter of 1649. Winthrop would die in early 1649 of natural causes at the age of 61, probably not long after he wrote his last journal entry. To give a broader perspective on the execution of Margaret Jones and some of the other events that we read about, I am now going to read a section from this article, Witchcraft in the American Colonies, 1647 to 62, by Frederick C. Drake. This article was published in the winter 1968 issue of American Quarterly. Salem has thus become the focal point of historical analysis of colonial witchcraft. The outburst of 1692 has been effectively separated from its American ancestry, and its origins located somewhere in the 1680s. Earlier cases have been ignored and miscounted, for there were over 95 incidents involving colonial people with witchcraft before 1692. Nearly 60 of these incidents occurred between the adoption of the Cambridge Platform of 1648 and the acceptance of the Halfway Covenants of 1662. These incidents led to at least 83 trials between 1647 and 1691, in which 22 people were executed, and many others suffered banishment, whipping, and financial loss. Yet of the 22 executions, 20 had taken place between 1647 and 1662, and the first 8 occurred in less than 4 years. Evidence of witchcraft was accumulated in 3 ways: by confession, by searchings for the witch marks, and by collection of testimonies and accusations of witchcraft. The first 2 alone meant automatic proof of guilt, followed by execution. Margaret Jones was examined and found to possess a devil's mark, a teat as fresh as if it had been newly sucked. This revealed where an imp or animal of the devil had fastened onto her, a physical affirmation of the reversal of the covenant. Both the Stapleys and Knapp cases in Connecticut were concerned with the discovery of witch marks on Mrs. Knapp's body, and her fate was sealed by 7 neighbors who claimed to have seen them. Mrs. Stapleys refused to believe Goodwife Knapp was a witch, and suspicion fell on her also. As Mrs. Knapp's body was brought off the gallows, Mrs. Stapleys examined it for the alleged witch marks, and found none. Mrs. Lockwood, one of the 7 accusers, declared that they had been there. She had them, and she confessed that she was a witch. That is sufficient. The majority who did withstand the sin of witchcraft did not do so merely as a passive exercise. As the elect, they were presented with biblical evidence of the existence of witchcraft. They would hardly be good Calvinists if they did not seek out witches, for Calvin stood explicitly by the Old Testament book of Exodus, which declared, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And this decree was written into the laws of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Haven, and Plymouth. Upon witchcraft itself, Calvin had declared, "Now the Bible teaches that there are witches, and that they must be slain. God expressly commands that all witches and enchantresses be put to death, and this law of God is a universal law." For this reason, the early colonists of New England were good Calvinists, precisely because they did search out witches. Witchcraft was not only a temptation to resist, it was an evil requiring positive eradication before God. Consequently, colonial leaders became increasingly concerned during the 1640s with the emergence of witchcraft activity as a manifestation of the devil's desire to subvert God's commonwealth. Puritan, Anglican, Pilgrim, and Catholic alike took steps to arm themselves with legal protection against his agents. In 1636, Plymouth included in its summary offenses, liable to death, the action of solemn compaction or conversing with the devil by way of witchcraft, conjuration, or the like. The 1641 Massachusetts Bay Body of Liberties and the 1642 Connecticut Capital Code both included as their second law, "If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death." All 3 colonies reenacted these laws in 1646. Rhode Island accepted a witchcraft law on May 19, 1647, after its charter had been granted. The law stated that witchcraft is forbidden by this present assembly to be used in this colony, and the penalty imposed by the authority that we are subjected to is felony of death. New Haven possessed a law similar to Connecticut's. Armed thus, the colonies were prepared to deal with outbreaks of witchcraft, as well as conform to the laws of England on the subject. By 1662, they had made good use of their legal provisions in a 15-year campaign against the devil's agents in nearly all of the colonies. While New England laws and religion attempted to undermine the great enemy of God and mankind, the pressure for an outbreak of witchcraft activity came from overseas. In England, against a background of mounting tension and later warfare between king and parliament, hundreds of witchcraft accusations were made. Between 1645 and 1647, over 200 witches were executed. The period of greatest slaughter was in the summer of 1645, when Matthew Hopkins, witch finder general, was at the height of his campaign to find witches. Altogether, the decade between 1637 and 1647 produced the greatest percentage of hangings per indictment, 42%, of any period in English witchcraft history. Later still, outbreaks were recorded in Scotland from 1643 to 1650, East Anglia in 1645, Newcastle 1648, Kent 1652, and Scotland again in 1661. In Europe, the Swedish case of bewitched children, sometimes referred to as the possible inspiration for the Goodwin case of 1688 and the Salem episode of 1692, occurred in 1661. These persecutions undoubtedly troubled the colonists of New England. Certainly the colonial magistrates knew of English methods of examining suspected witches. In their search for familiars, witch marks, and imps, they were adopting the same practices of Matthew Hopkins. In the very first case brought before the bench at Boston, the court was desirous that the same course which hath been taken in England for the discovery of witches, by watching may also be taken here with the witch now in question. Thus, for Margaret Jones, the court ordered that a strict watch be set about her every night, and that her husband be confined to a private room, and watched also. On September 22, 1642, the year after the colony of Massachusetts' promulgation of its witchcraft law, John Winthrop drew attention in his journal to the unsettled frame of spirits which had led many people to emigrate to the West Indies, to New Amsterdam, Long Island, or even back to England. He blamed the sudden fall of land and cattle, the scarcity of money and foreign commodities, and people fleeing from the colony, for the unrest in Massachusetts. From that date forward, evidence of satanic intervention in the colony's affairs fills his pages. The corn crop of 1643 was spoiled by pigeons and mice. A great storm swept over Newbury, darkening the air with dirt on July 5, 1643. Lights were seen near Boston and over the northeast point in January of 1644, at the site where Captain Chaddock's pennants had been blown up, reputedly by a necromancer. A voice was heard calling across the water several times. At Hingham, a man named Painter, who turned Anabaptist and prevented his wife from baptizing their child, even though she was a member of the church, disturbed the church leaders sufficiently in July for them to have the man whipped for reproaching the Lord's ordinance. Out of just such small beginnings arose the great tensions leading to the halfway covenants, as a solution for the baptismal problems of the children of non-church members. In 1645, the wife of Hartford's governor, Mrs. Hopkins, lost her reason and understanding. Externally, preparations were made for a second war against the Pequot Indians, for Satan may stir up and combine many of his instruments against the churches of Christ. The Hingham militia had to be lectured by Winthrop on the meanings of liberty to obey their leaders. On August 28, 1645, a day of fasting and humiliation for troubles in Old and New England was held, the third such day to be set aside since 1643. By 1646, the General Court of Massachusetts was inundated with petitions of grievances. Then came two monumental calamities in 1646 and 1647. The colonies were just struggling back to prosperity after the Depression of 1642 and 43, when the corn, wheat, and barley crops were ruined by black worms and caterpillars, which ate the blades and tassels and left the rest to wither. The churches held a day of humiliation. Secondly, in 1647, an epidemic swept the country among Indians, English, and Dutch. It weakened the people so much that the gathering of the remaining crops was lost for want of help, even though few died in Massachusetts and Connecticut. In the presence of so many other troubles, the absence of war may have seemed small consolation to New Englanders, for when the Synod of 1648 met at Cambridge to settle such errors, objections, and scruples as had been raised about it by some of the young heads in the country, the barriers of resistance to the realities of the devil's work were going down in Connecticut and Massachusetts. While Winthrop glorified the Synod as the triumphant representative of the Churches of Christ in New England, his fellow magistrates in Boston and Hartford were finding fresh confirmation of the devil's malignant concern. As Mary Johnson and Margaret Jones went to their respective scaffolds, the whole formula of religious ferment, added to social distress and natural disasters, which later characterized the Salem episode, was present in 1647. Once underway, the witchcraft cases of 1647 to 1662 added to the tension from which they sprang. They did this in a steady stream of cases year by year, rather than in one frenzied outburst, such as occurred in 1692. Yet many of the characteristics of the Salem witch trials were in evidence in the earlier trials. The indictments were often concerned with the bewitchment of children and animals. Mary Johnson and Mary Parsons were accused of killing their own children by witchcraft. The former had smothered her child, and before execution left another baby born in prison to the care of Nathaniel Rescue, the jailer. Mary Parsons, after marrying Hugh Parsons on October 27, 1645, had 2 sons to him, born on October 4, 1649, and October 26, 1650. Both died in less than a year of their births, and the evidence suggests that after the death of the second one, on March 1, 1651, the mother lost her reason. Although denunciations of witchcraft were leveled against Hugh Parsons by his neighbors, it was Mary Parsons who was imprisoned at Boston on May 1st, and her case came before the General Court 6 days later. Later still, the cases involving Mrs. Kendall and Goodwife Garlick concerned the deaths of other people's children. Mrs. Kendall was executed for bewitching to death a young child belonging to Goodman Jennings of Watertown. The child's nurse testified that Mrs. Kendall had fondled the child, that soon afterward it changed color and died. The court received this evidence without bothering to call the child's parents. After Mrs. Kendall's execution, the parents testified that the child had died of exposure caused by the neglect of the nurse. By this time, the latter was in prison for adultery, and she died there. The case ended with no further recantations, striking evidence of how the stigma of witchcraft tainted the innocent and muted inquiry. Further afield in East Hampton, in the winter of 1657 and 1658, Goodwife Garlick escaped from an identical accusation by a fellow servant, who claimed she had bewitched her child. The head of the household, Lyon Gardiner, gave evidence that the baby died from the neglect of the mother, yet the magistrates at East Hampton ordered 2 men, Thomas Baker and John Hand, to go into Kennicott for to bring us under their government, and also to carry Goodwife Garlick, that she may be delivered up into the authorities there for the trial of the cause of witchcraft of which she is suspected. Some of the evidence in many of the cases concern the illnesses of witnesses and animals, and accidental occurrences. In Maryland, Peter Godson and his wife alleged that he became lame after seeing the wife of Richard Manship. In the first Mrs. Godman case of 1653 in New Haven, she was accused on May 21st of knowing whatever was done at church meetings, muttering to herself, being responsible for the sickness of Reverend Mr. Hook's son, and for the very strange fits which hath continued at times ever since, of Mrs. Bishop, who had lost her own children. Later Mrs. Godman quarreled with the wife of Colonial Treasurer Mrs. Atwater, who then blamed her when she found Betty Brewster, a servant, ill in a most miserable case, hearing a most dreadful noise which put her in great fear and trembling, which put her into such a sweat, and in ye morning she looked as one yet had been almost dead. 3 days later, on March 24th, 1653, further depositions were made regarding the cause of Mrs. Bishop's fainting fits. As early as 1648, this type of evidence had brought about the conviction of Margaret Jones, blamed when her neighbor's children fell ill. So that article from American Quarterly told about a period from 1647 to 62, where there were 20 executions of witches. It also mentioned that these practices mirrored what was going on in England, where even more witches were killed during this period, which coincided with the British Civil War. I am now going to read a much shorter section from this 1898 article written by Herbert C. Varney, titled Physicians and Apothecaries in Puritan New England, published in the Southern Medical Record. This article seems to defend Margaret Jones as a woman who is simply practicing medicine. The first women who tried to engage in the practice of medicine in Massachusetts do not seem to have met with very good success. The famous Anne Hutchinson tried her hand at medicine, but on account of her religious opinions was banished from the colony. Another, Margaret Jones of Charlestown, was indicted and found guilty of witchcraft upon the following evidence. She was found to have a malignant touch, so that whosoever she touched were taken with deafness and vomiting. She practiced physic, her medicines being harmless, such as anise seed and liquors, yet they had extraordinary and violent effects. She told those who would not use the physic that they would never get well, and accordingly their diseases continued, contrary to the efforts of the physicians and surgeons. She also had the witch's marks. In spite of her protestations of innocence, poor Margaret was hanged as a witch on Boston Common in 1648. Those were the days when this law was on the statute books. If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. So that article from 1898 seems to portray Margaret Jones as a woman who was simply practicing medicine, not as an evil witch. It seems that this period from 1647 through 1662 was similar to the later Salem witch trials that occurred all at once in 1692, but these earlier events are less well known. Winthrop's journal also mentioned a friendly Indian, Uncas, who was a Mohegan. He was apparently targeted by some of the hostile Indians. Uncas had assisted the colonists in fighting the Pequots in the Pequot War in the 1630s. He is listed in the article on Witchcraft in New England from the 1968 issue of American Quarterly as being a victim of witchcraft by hostile Indians in 1651. It says that he reported that the hostile Indians were bedeviling him. I have not been able to find any record of these Indians being executed. The article just says that an inquiry was held by the commissioners of the United Colonies. So perhaps Uncas really was bedeviled by hostile Indians, or it could be that since he had long been a peaceful Indian who was allied with the settlers and had adopted their ways, he also adopted their custom of accusing his enemies of witchcraft. Let us know in the comments what you think about these periods of hysteria concerning witches and witchcraft that occurred much more often than just in Salem in 1692. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Here on this channel we keep actual history alive by reading directly from old books, written down long ago by the people who forged our civilization. If you'd like to help keep actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.